Good afternoon. My name is Maria Schatz, and I'm a scientific program manager for the NIHS Office of Data Science. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the ELK seminar series. By the way of background, ELK stands for Environmental Health Language Collaborative, and our mission is to advance integrative environmental health research by promoting access, use, and harmonization of data through interoperable terminologies and best practices. Before we move on, you can get involved with ELK by visiting ELK website, joining our listserv, or contacting directly ICF support team, Charles Schmidt, who is the director of the NIHS Office of Data Science, or myself, using the provided emails. So having said that, I'm happy to introduce our today's speaker. Dr. Lee Carmody is an information scientist in the Office of Data Science at the NIHS. She's leading our efforts in data curation and ontology development. Dr. Carmody contributes to advancing data transparency and the implementation of fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible data principles to environmental health topics. Previously, Lee held various roles at the Jackson Lab, where she was involved in curation patient sequencing data, annotating rare disease phenotypes, and contributing to the development of biomedical ontologies, such as medical action ontology, MAXO, and editing of several other ontologies, including HPO, Mondo, and cell ontology. Dr. Carmody obtained her PhD in molecular physiology and biophysics from Vanderbilt University. She was a project lead for preclinical drug discovery at the Broad Institute. And while at the Broad Institute, she managed large data sets and applied the data standards to each data set, which put her on the path to her current career. So with that, welcome, Lee. And thank you for agreeing to give the talk. The podium is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to get this up. Yes, I'm Lee Carmody. I'm in the Office of Data Scientist here at NIEHS, and I'm going to discuss best practices both in ontology development and curation. And this is part of what Maria just said. This is like the mea culpa. This is my background, that I formerly worked for the Monarch Initiative and particularly Peter Robinson. And so I've edited a number of different ontologies and worked on different tools. That is my perspective and the point of view. There are additional resources out there and I will try to point them out. But the background is, what do we want to do with data, our data or somebody else's data? And generally, you want to extract meaningful insight, test hypotheses, try to identify patterns and trends, gain deeper understanding. In some cases, you want to make a knowledge graph to show links between, in this case, it's showing genes and phenotypes and diseases, but you can add in your area of interest, whether or not it's chemicals, chemicals used as drugs or as exposures or geographical area, and try to find those connections. But the way to do that is to have data that is fair, and we hear this a lot. It's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But I'm going to try to give a talk of how we do some of this and how we treat our data and vocabularies so that both humans and data machines can reuse our data. And just basic definitions, there are health and data standard terminologies. These are standardized terms, so we all know exactly what we're talking about. They provide representation of knowledge within a specific domain. There's also common data elements, which standardizes a particular questions and limits the number of allowable responses. This is particularly good if you want to standardize age or say a method of measurement. But ontologies And you can tell by the topic of or the title of my talk, this is my wheelhouse is a systematic arrangement of important categories or concepts and that are specifically defined in a field and showing the relationships between them. And in a lot of ways, ontologies can do some of the work of standardized terminologies and CDEs, but they all can be worked together to define data. Ontologies, this is largely what we're thinking about. Ontologies are a hierarchy. The higher level terms are generally called parents, and then you have child terms, and then when you get down to same level, they're often called sibling terms. Each of these show a relationship between the terms. Sometimes a child term has two parents. Can be helpful when things have more than one concept areas. Like I chose an example of the liver here. It is both a digestive gland and an exocrine organ. And showing these relationships between these do tend to be important. So, and I'm going to talk to you about best practices for ontology development. But I don't expect everybody here to run off and go develop their own ontology. And though you could, I certainly did not originally go to school for this, and I've learned it from, my own necessity. But understanding the ontology development will help you ontology development best practices will help you select ontologies. It will help you improve those ontologies and work with other groups on how to make it better for your own usage. And if somebody go ahead and let me know if you have any questions. And I will say, I have taken some of the next slides from an MD PhD student from Peter Robinson's lab. He has gone on to be a psychiatrist, so you can tell that for the examples, they're definitely behavioral, human behavioral bend for my explanations. So term requirements, this is just anatomy of an ontology term. The asterisk items are the absolute bare minimum for an ontology term. You need a clearly labeled, definable term. You know exactly what that term is. You need a specific ID that tells you which term it is and what ontology it is. And you need a textual definition that explains it, that is more than just restating the label. And often that is difficult, but that is something you want to strive towards. And you need a parent term in some way so that you know where in your ontology it is associated. Ideally, you have more information as well, like synonyms, because you may be an ophthalmologist and have a particular way of referring to something, but you may be a layperson or a scientist in a lab. So trying to cover as many synonyms as possible so that when you go to one paper to the other paper, you're able to join these together. References are definitely helpful. You can go back to an original paper that has an explicit definition or usage. Comments might give you more information of how it's used in the field or how a synonym is used or association with a particular disease or whatever is relevant in your field. And logical definition, I won't touch on this too much unless, somebody's really wants to be in ontology development, but the critical part in this is that you're taking pieces, parts from other ontologies to build a machine readable definition. And the advantage to this is the machine can read it and know exactly how to build up this term. It also leverages other ontologies, like this is an Uberon term. These are Pato terms, if you're familiar with them. And it's using the hierarchy within those other ontologies to add information to your ontology term. Now, the true path rule is critical. It's both helpful for picking terms, but this is also an error that is made both with ontology development and for picking terms for your own annotation. And I'll explain a little bit about this. So say if you have patients in a paper with maintenance insomnia, meaning a patient can go to sleep fine, but they are often waking up. This is a type of insomnia. Now, if you have another paper that has patients with insomnia and you want to combine that, you are going to combine to this level because maintenance insomnia is always a type of insomnia, which is always a type of sleep disturbance, which is always a phenotypic abnormality. And unless it is there's some sort of other specification within the ontology, this is how it always goes. And the machine readable information, they're going to start rolling up this information. That's why it's important to not just select the term that, fits your situation the best. You also need to look at the hierarchy and how it is arranged to see if this is always true. An example of something that might be confusing, and sorry, my cat always joins me when I give a talk, but impulsivity is a kind of disinhibition for humans, running out and doing things unintentionally. And while a person with mania may have impulsivity, just because you have a patient has impulsivity does not mean they are always manic. And so you have to be careful that impulsivity is always a disinhibition, which is always a behavioral abnormality, and not make other associations that aren't always true. So this is the true path rule, that it always needs to be true, as long as that is what is designated in your ontology. Oops, sorry, wrong direction. The next rule is pi rule, and this is for developing an ontology to try to define as many terms as possible under a term. So you want to make sure you carve out the full pi. Otherwise, if you have a term that is not filled in, you are going to have, annotation fields that are annotated to a higher level to insomnia, because it is not clearly defined within your terms. Now, you may not know everything when you start developing an ontology, and that is where other people from inside the field may be able to help inform you. You are missing one more slice of this pie. And this is particularly true for environmental health. A lot of these ontologies were not built with environmental health in mind. And so having your expertise to add in to be able to fill in the rest of this pie is important. Let's see. Another best practice is to avoid bundled terms. This is avoid creating terms that refer to multiple terms that do not easily fit under a broader term. This is particularly problematic for computers to be able to understand that. We may know what stocky habilitus is, It is generally defined as a body type defined by short stature, overweight, and muscular appearance. However, trying to parse all that information is difficult for a computer, or if a group of subjects have a partial phenotype, like they're overweight, but they're not muscular in appearance. So keeping those in separate individual phenotypes is helpful. The only time exception to this is when the bundled term always occur together. And I don't have an example about that, but that would be the one exception. But for curation purposes, you would try to do a short stature annotation and an overweight annotation, and broad shoulder might be. There's also a muscular type annotation. So you want to annotate each of those individual phenotypes individually so that you can do calculations for that, so it's easily interoperable, especially, so this is true for a human. Having a stocky habilis is not necessarily true in a mouse. So by having those individual phenotypes, you can more easily integrate it between species. And 5 o'clock rule, largely this is about being findable. Thinking about your ontology and thinking about where your term goes, it is critical. It also means that all of the labels leading up to that are obvious and readable as well. Because as many as I told you, it's important to have synonyms, but inevitably there will be a synonym left off. So if you have approached an ontology like mammalian phenotype ontology or human phenotype ontology, they have 20,000 terms. So likely they have the term that you may be interested in, but maybe you're thinking of it in a different way. Maybe you're thinking of, of an inset eye or a sunken eye, and that synonym isn't there. So you should be able to look down the ontology pathway of abnormal eye features, or try to drill down until you find that term. And just this is helpful for logical definition. Again, I don't expect anybody here to build them, but having a logical definition and using reasoning will help put your ontology term in all of the places that, say, an eyeball would be in another ontology that is dealing with anatomy. So that an eyeball is part of the head, or it's a part of the nervous system if you're talking about the nerves innervating it. So it helps leverage that other ontologies that are giving structure. So given this background for ontology development, that can also give you clues into curation best practices. It helps you find the ontology that's going to be good for you. It's also going to help you find terms. And importantly, because I do think environmental health is missing many terms that are relevant to them, I'm going to have a little bit of a section on how to add terms and edit terms. So finding an ontology, I think most everybody has dabbled in this, but here are some resources that are available. There's the Ontology Lookup Service, BioPortal, Ontobee, and OboFoundry also has a list of ontologies that are relevant. There are other things available, even Google topic area plus ontology should be able to find other papers about ontologies that are available. But these are ontologies that are big enough that have submitted into these ontologies. And I've added a few reasons why you might pick one over the other. I do tend to use Ontology lookup service the most, and it's partly because of this here. I'm showing an example of UPheno, and UPheno is a phenotype ontology that pulls in both, well, human phenotype ontology, this is zebrafish phenotype ontology, mammalian phenotype ontology, and there are many, many other ontologies that are pulled in with this, but it explicitly says where the term is from by using this label here. And it also shows how many terms are children of this term. And I'm not going to discuss, if anybody is aware of the formal ontology hierarchy, the high level terms, but sometimes when you open up an ontology, oops, it is not clear where the terms are. And so this kind of gives you an idea of where to start looking for your term. And I find that very helpful. BioPortal has important mapping. I'm pretty sure I searched the word for rainwater, and ENVO term has come up here, but then here has a similar term, and Sweet Ontology has another term for rainwater. And so having that mapping feature is very helpful. OntoB has Sparkle queries. If you know anything about it, it's kind of a way to query different ontologies and pull back terms, or who is annotating with them or using those terms. And Obo Foundry, I'm going to go in much more detail, but it also has a list of ontologies that have kind of passed a certain threshold and all kind of work together. Now, I'm not going through all of the principles of Obo Foundry, but they have lots of resource available. It's a collection of science and biology-based ontologies. There are some additional ones as well, but they have all been vetted, and they have all a higher level BFO, COB compliant, formal language, if you know what that is. So they are interoperable by definition. And if you notice down here, I took it straight from their website. They skipped 13 to 16 to 20, so I had nothing to do with it. But anyways, that's apparently numeration is not one of the qualifications for being part of Obo Foundry. But they do have a kind of a rating system available, and they show you different ontologies, and if there are any sort of warnings here, they just have a green, yellow, red. And I will say, take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. I find that it's this looks harsher than it is, and I do recommend the vast majority of term ontologies that are in Obo Foundry. So even with the red, that's more about ontology building and using that for building your own ontology. But I still recommend numerous of these ontologies in here. Somebody actually recently told me about this. It's another way to put in an ontology and have it be rated. And they seem to be using a lot of the similar rating systems that that the Obo Foundry is using. And I have not used it, but it might be another resource to test whether or not there are issues with an ontology. For curation purposes, though, all of these principles are really important, but you might have a slightly different point of view if you're trying to use this to annotate your data source. One, you want to pay attention to the scope, and that makes sense, but sometimes it's not always clear where or what area you want to to use your term or pull from. And, you know, if you have a specific fish phenotype, you may not want to run to human phenotype ontology to add your term. And that's because they will say, well, people don't have fins, and you know, we don't want to add that term. So scope is going to be important to you. Textual definitions, I having a written out definition is always important. Not every ontology has this, and certainly not for every single term, which they should, but um, you know, having that information makes it clear that you are using the correct term. And the other ones that I'm highlighting are a lot about whether or not the ontology itself is active, if you can notify them, if they're willing to make changes, add terms, because particularly since environmental health has fewer or less coverage in the ontology domains, you may need to have another term, or you may need to have a synonym added, or suggest a rearrangement. And so their responsiveness is going to be important. And this is kind of a real life example. I'm not showing all the data, but that you may have a rat and a mouse and a guppy, all with liver adenomas. And there are different ways to annotate your data, and they're not wrong. It's just how you think about your data. You can think of the pathology of it to describe the exact tumor itself. And empath has hepatocellular adenoma. You can talk about the disease of hepatocellular adenoma. Or you can talk about the phenotype, having an increase of liver adenoma. And this is not a statistical difference. This is just an observation. You see a tumor, and tumors aren't normal. So by definition, it's abnormal. If you see one, then that's an incidence of increased liver adenoma. And they have it for mammalian phenotype ontology and zebrafish phenotype ontology. But there are issues with using any of these three that are available. I mean, you could develop your own, but that's not reusing and trying to use what's already out there. Sorry, I have a little bit of an issue with the adding in my animations, but empath. So empath has a lot of tumor information for pathology. It is a mouse pathology ontology, and a rat and a guppy aren't mice. It does not have a issue tracker, so that's also a negative thing. So making changes are difficult. There is contact information, and I have reached out to the owner of empath, and they are willing to make some minimal changes, but there's not funding and it's not a priority. So that is a caveat. For Mondo, this is specifically a hierarchy in Mondo. It does have the disease hepatocellular adenoma. It is under human disease, and in the true path rule, that would mean this is a human disease. So that is not quite appropriate. You can use a phenotype ontology. The issues here is, yes, you might quibble whether or not it's increased incidence or it should be increased amount. You're also dealing with different phenotype ontologies when you're talking about rat, mouse, guppy. Two could go under mammalian phenotype ontology. There isn't a guppy phenotype ontology that I'm aware of, so you might have to use zebrafish ontology. So these are all issues with this. Now, to correct this, I have reached out to Empath, as I mentioned before, and they are willing and interested in changing the label to mammalian pathology. But they're not willing to go further than that. Um, uh, I know people in Mondo and DO are actively responsive to edits and may be able to either remove human disease from this hierarchy or maybe make a second branch with all of these in an animal disease branch. But that does take time. And oops, yep, sorry about that. And for the phenotypes, there is a bridging phenotype ontology called UPheno. I think I mentioned it previously. It pulls in all the other phenotype ontologies as well. However, it only bridges really the ones that are following a pattern that are similar between the phenotype ontologies. So if you have a very specific phenotype for, say, your guppy, you're probably going to have to go directly to ZP and ask whether or not they'd be willing to. I don't know the difference between a zebrafish and a guppy, whether or not it could be 100% covered. But the only thing I'm saying is all of these do have issues, but you could probably reasonably annotate your data and say that this is what the phenotype is that I have seen, or this is the tumor pathology that I have seen. And whatever road you decide to go down, knowing that there are issues in every single one, just keep going and be consistent. You use the best choice for you. But once you choose, you don't want to do empath for one, disease for another, and a phenotype for another, because that makes it much harder for them to be interoperable. It's not impossible, but it is more difficult. So something I've alluded to and is that we as users need to be involved to add terms and to edit. Not everybody feels comfortable doing that, and I do understand that. And finding it's not always the easiest. I do find just putting into a search engine, whatever your ontology name plus GitHub, and a GitHub tracker will inevitably show up. You can go to GitHub itself and search, but it's not the best querying. I mean, we all know GitHub and other search engines tend to do a better job. And I just listed a few just to have it as resources. These are the GitHub repos for several ontologies that I know are commonly used. There are more. You have to kind of look out for what is critical to yours. But I'm going to show you a little bit about how to make a GitHub ticket, because I think part of it is just knowing and not being nervous about it, and nobody's going to think you're dumb. It's going to show the ontology that it's being used and that people are being thoughtful and can help build this ontology. So some questions: what makes a good GitHub issue ticket? First of all, and I'll show you how to do this, is search it for existing issues before creating one. A short descriptive title, a short explanation of the problem, including an example, mention any other related issues, tag users, and I will show you this in a moment, give specifics about how to close or complete the ticket, and be polite. And here I'm actually going to, I have, as long as we're on time, I'm gonna actually show you a little bit of how to search for this and create a ticket. First of all, I just did, in this case, human phenotype ontology plus GitHub. You don't have to do it in Google. You can do it in whatever your search engine is. It will come up. This leads you to a GitHub repo. Now, there's a lot of other stuff here. Unless you are building your own ontology, you're probably not going to be interested in this as just a general user. What you want to do is go to issues. There's only one other thing before we go to the issues that I want to point out. This page also lets you know how active an ontology is. And there's something here called releases. That means they're actively changing and making edits to the ontology. And you could see just 4 days ago, there was a release. If you go here, some are more explicit than others. They actually show you what classes were added and what has changed. But being able to see that a release happened in March and January and December, you know that's a very active ontology. They're willing to make changes and work with you. Issues here. This is where you want to make a query look a tiny typo. You want to change the textual definition. You want to have a new term request. Here I'm showing you mammalian phenotype ontology. It has the same structure. Oops, I should have gone back. Here issues. You could see I recently opened new synonym request for a particular term, and I tried to make as clear of a title as I could. And then I explicitly said, this is the term, please add increased red blood cell number as this synonym. Thanks, I've got a response. And you could say, thanks, and at Sue below, and that's how you tag somebody. If you want to tag another ticket, thanks, this is like, I don't know right now. If you put a number sign, any of these, any other tickets that are available in the repo will show up. If you know the number, like 304, you can tag it like that. And that's one of the ways to link different issues together. I'm not going to do that because you know, I don't want to erroneously tag another ticket. But you can just do that and comment, and it's easy enough. There are other labels that I don't have permissions to add on after the fact. Sue added a synonym request label so that they know this synonym request is an easy thing. This is something they can do very quickly. But for their own tracking purposes, they've added things. There are repos like Human Phenotype Ontology that have specific templates. And that is helpful because, you know, if you want to add a term, it kind of shows you what the preferred things are to add. Like this is a preferred term label, synonyms, a textual definition, what parent term, what diseases it's associated with. You don't have to fill out all of this information, but the more you fill it out, the quicker somebody is going to be to get to your request. And I'll go back to PowerPoint. So here is somebody's just a typo request. It's very simple, it's straightforward. You can tell pretty much everything from the label, but there's a little bit more information in the actual ticket. Here is an okay term request. They put in preferred term label. They didn't have any synonyms, and they had a definition, which is good, but they don't have a parent term. So that means the curator or whoever's in charge of this will go back and have to find exactly where it is in the tracker. You don't have to put disease characterized by this term, and you don't have to have a nano attribution. That's a way of thanking you and just putting in you were helpful and responsible for this term. It's also a way to track other users and to be able to say, you know, this many users have been adding, and they can use it for their own you know, trying to get more funding or add it to a paper to say there are this many editors of this ontology. So it's helpful, not required by any stretch of the mind. Additional resources, there are a lot of resources available. Most of what I told you about on how to write a GitHub issue is actually straight from the Obo Academy tutorials, you know, using GitHub. They have a whole sheet on it. They have lessons. Some of these lessons are just web pages you could go through and work on your own. Some of the, actually probably the majority of them also have a YouTube video that is associated with them so that you can follow along with a particular lesson. Let's see, additional resources, and here, along with the Obo Academy, I attached the YouTube Obo Academy site. The Obo Foundry has a lot about their own principles. They also, besides just having a list and like a rating system per se, Ontology editor, if you get really involved in actually wanting to edit ontologies, Protege is an open source. They have a web version of it, and there's also a downloadable program. But they also have tutorials on how to use Protege. They have it on ontology information in general. I'm not as familiar with Cicero Environmental Informatics, but they do have tutorials on ontology formats. EBI or EMBL, many may be have information about. Sorry, if somebody could speak up, I don't know if I could see the ask the questions, but in 1 minute, I'll try to reply. EBI has lots, including on ontology trainings and tutorials, but they have so much information at all. And then again, somebody else pointed out the ontology pitfall scanner. I'm not as familiar with that, but please check it out. And I think I'm nearing the end of the talk, so I can answer questions. Question of the use of phrase like increased adenomas. When in environmental health, we often need more quantitative flexibility. Do you have any comments? So maybe you could give me more information about what you mean. Increased is just more than none. I think you're going to have to define it in your own data, like, you know, wild type will have 4. And
hi, I don't know if I unmute, if I can speak. Is that possible?
That's fine. I can hear you anyways.
Thank you so much. It was a great presentation. And I thought you did a great job of highlighting, you know, specific components of these detailed phenotypes. But one of the things that I think that I see as a problem across these phenotypes is that in environmental health, you know, we so often need to think about dose response. And so in this particular case, you know, the phenotype is described as increased adenomas, which is great for phenotype and maybe from a medical situation, but it's, you know, problematic. So I'm wondering, is somebody working on separating like functional terms that would deal with the dose response from these phenotypes? Because it seems like that's a lack that we're having here in some of the ways that the ontologies operate for, you know, environmental language.
So I'm trying to think what terms would you like to see? Or
well, I think, you know, having been on some of these committees and looking at all of the things that we actually ultimately want to have AI pick up, like kinetic and dynamic things and dose response, that we need better functional ontologies that stand alone. So in this particular case, I would separate, you know, I would probably put presence of adenomas, not increased presence of adenomas in this case, and then to link it with something that then says, you know, at doses such and such, or at life stage, you know, a twofold theme. Because otherwise it seems like we're going to have these difficulties with some of the identification phases that we see in risk assessment and environmental health. I don't know. I just think it makes more work, but you know, I'm seeing at some point where all this work on kinetics and dynamics is not going to get in the way that I think we need to do it for ontologies.
okay,
so I'm calling them functional ontologies, you know?
Yeah, so I think there's probably more than one answer to your question, kind of like I said
I know,
previously.
sorry. I just was so excited about what you talked about, and they were so articulate that I thought I'd just raise it, because the purpose of these seminars is, of course, to bring up what tools are there and also to do some gap analysis. Thanks. You don't have to answer it if you don't want to. It's fine.
One suggestion I will have is that you still use the increased adenomas term, and then you do what's called post-compose. You could have an ontology work with you to develop all your terms, like presence of adenoma at, you know, I don't know, neonatal phase, blah, blah, blah. But the other way is called a post-compose, where you take and Jennifer, I know, does this a lot. So you take the phenotype in one column, and then you add, you know, your stage at another, you know, neonatal, and then increased, and you'd have to, like, you're writing very much a logical definition. You're taking all the ontology parts to build up to what it is. That is probably the easiest way to do it with what is already existing. Beyond that, I don't know. This might be developing, and I do think this field has room to add their own ontology, because I do think there's enough terms that are not available for ontology. I again,
can I jump in?
yes.
Sorry. So Elaine, there's two components in my view. One is, what are you looking at? Presence or increased adenoma, doesn't really matter. And then the other component is, what were the conditions that led you to it? And they're not, you don't want one ontological term for all of that. It's too complex. It'd be a paragraph. So what we're doing in the DTT data dictionary is we have observational terms, morphologies, where we saw them, what tissue, and then we have something called metadata. So the life stage of the organism, or the dose. Actually, we just store the dose unit. The dose itself is free text. So you can build all of those up in your data, annotating the data. So the whole thing is not an ontology, but each term will come from an ontology. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does actually, and that links then back to the metadata You know, ultimately, I think we are going to need some of these other, what I keep calling as functional terms. But I like what you, because that was this idea of paragraphs describing this and not having a subtlety to it, all in this definition of increased adenomas is silly. You're right. So thanks. Really great concepts and discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer, for stepping in. That was great explanation. And just my final conclusions. I'm at the end here. Data standards are critical for integrating. Ontologies are especially helpful to establish relationships. Following ontology development best practices aids all users of ontologies, not just those building them. There is no way to no one way to annotate data, as has been shown. Using ontology terms aids in linking data. And again, there is no perfect ontology. Please don't be shy. I've developed ontologies and I'm excited when other users find my ontology and say there's an error. And as a user, it's helpful because, you know, there's somebody has their own use case for it, but if it can be expanded to meet other users here, I think many, or if not most, if there's funding available, they're willing to work with you. Again, it might be strategies like Jennifer suggested, that, you know, each portion of the experiment has their own ontology term and build it, but maybe there is a case for presence of a lot of adenomas versus presence of a little. Maybe those are separate phenotypes. And an ontology would be, or could be, willing to work with you. And this is true for all sorts, chemical, anatomical. Things really aren't set in stone. People call things different words, different synonyms in different fields. So please think of these as flexible. And just thank you for my whole group. I'm part of the Office of Data Scientists, and there are a lot of people who help. Thank you.
Great talk. Thank you, Lee. I don't see at this moment any more questions in the chat, but I was thinking maybe for our less experienced listeners, maybe you can give a simple example of what you can do with an ontology when your data is annotated with ontology compared to what you can do with a terminology annotation. Just
with the terminal, I do think it's there's a lot of machine learning. I gave the example of with insomnia, but you have a lot of papers or groups that are combining data, and some people go down to the finest detail, and some, especially clinical notes, but there are other mammalian phenotypes. They're talking about the crinkled whisker, but somebody else's paper has abnormal whiskers. Ontologies having this relationship of that a crinkled whisker is, you know, a type of abnormal whisker, or whatever you're talking about, being able to roll up and integrate that data across platforms is very helpful, and particularly important for me, who's not a chemist. So I can go down and drill down into, you know, my, your PFAS or your chemical of interest. But there are a lot of components about chemicals that in an ontology, having them show that, okay, there's carbon in this one, or it is has a role of a pesticide. And by having that information in an ontology, makes it like you can group all of the pesticides. Do you see the same phenotype with all groups of pesticides, or is it a particular kind with, you know, I don't know, fluoride in it or whatnot. Again, I'm not a chemist, so I apologize for poor examples here, but it's a way to pull out data associated versus the standardized terminology. If you only have the chemical and not anything that it's related to, then yes, you're very clear. This chemical causes this set of phenotypes or this set of issues in the environment. But you're not as able to pull out other things that are similar. So that's my explanation. So I am from John Graybiel. I'm no longer a manager of BioPortal. I can comfortably note that its additional useful features are a wider selection of ontologies. That's true than other sources and ontology. The recommender to aid in discovery and rich APIs, including for search and annotation. Yes, again, there are different. All I was trying to do is note that there are different strengths and weaknesses of all of ontology searches, just like there are strengths and weaknesses of ontologies themselves.
Okay, well, thank you again. And I think we can finish today's webinar just 1 minute before our time. And stay tuned to more seminar announcement coming through the ELK pathways. Thank you and have a good weekend, everyone.